The boardroom was a glass box suspended high above the city, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with power, ego, and expectation. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Uber's global headquarters, catching the edges of polished laptops, diamond watches, and steel pens that looked more like weapons than writing tools. Every man at that table had come prepared for battle, a financial one, but none were prepared for her. Aisha Monroe stood at the head of the long table, the company's logo gleaming faintly behind her on a massive LED screen. She wore a crisp white suit, sharp enough to cut through the tension that filled the room. Her hair was neatly pulled back, her expression calm, composed, a storm hidden behind soft eyes. Around her sat 12 investors, mostly men, mostly older, each representing millions of dollars in capital and even more in ego. They didn't say much at first. But their silence spoke loudly. A few eyes darted toward each other, a couple of whispers flickered like static. Someone cleared his throat, a small, dismissive sound that carried the weight of an unspoken question: can she really do this? She could feel it, the doubt, the judgment, the quiet calculation happening behind every polite nod. Aisha wasn't new to this kind of silence. It was the same silence that followed her into lecture halls at Harvard, where professors had mispronounced her name and peers had underestimated her before she even spoke. The same silence she'd faced in job interviews where executives mistook her for an assistant, not a candidate. Today, that silence had returned, only this time, she was the one holding the power clicker, the one standing at the head of the table. One of the older investors, a man in an expensive gray suit with silver hair and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes, leaned toward another and whispered just loud enough for the sound to carry. "Let's hope this diversity experiment knows what she's doing." The words landed like a slap, casual, cruel, confident. A few of the others chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that hides behind professionalism but drips with arrogance. Aisha didn't move. She didn't blink. Inside, her chest tightened for a heartbeat, but just one. Then, she exhaled slowly and let their words drift past her like smoke. They thought she was here because she looked good for the company's image. They thought she was a symbol. What they didn't know was that Aisha Monroe had been solving billion-dollar problems long before any of them knew her name. She had spent the last decade working across continents, building partnerships, leading crisis negotiations, and navigating cultural bridges that most CEOs could barely pronounce. She'd seen the rise and fall of markets, watched mergers crumble under ego, and learned that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who speaks last. Now, as she stood before them, she didn't see investors. She saw doubters, and doubters were fuel. Her fingers brushed lightly across the glass table as she prepared to begin her presentation. The surface reflected her image back at her, steady, centered, unshaken. She thought of her mother's words, whispered years ago in their small apartment in Atlanta. "Baby, don't ever shrink yourself just to fit into someone else's comfort zone. When they question you, let your excellence do the talking." That memory steadied her heart. She straightened her shoulders, pressed the button on her tablet, and the room lit up with data, a glowing constellation of charts, numbers, and projections. But even as the presentation loaded, she caught sight of one of the younger analysts exchanging a smirk with another. Their expression said it all: she's not ready. She doesn't belong here. Aisha smiled slightly. Good, she thought. Let them underestimate me. It'll make the ending that much sweeter. For a brief moment, her eyes drifted to the skyline beyond the glass. The city looked alive, cars threading through streets, people crossing intersections, the pulse of everyday life moving far below. She thought of how far she'd come. There was a time when she'd driven for Uber herself, juggling late-night deliveries and early-morning study sessions, chasing a future no one else could see for her. Now, she was here. The girl who once drove the car was now driving the company. She turned back to the board, lifted her chin, and began, her voice smooth and unwavering. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone poised but firm. Before we begin, let me remind you of one thing: leadership doesn't come from comfort. It comes from conviction. And today, I'm here to show you why conviction is exactly what Uber needs. The words hung in the air, silencing even the smug whispers. For the first time, every eye was on her, really on her. The battle had begun. But Aisha wasn't afraid. She wasn't there to survive the boardroom. She was there to own it. The hum of the projector filled the boardroom as the first slides illuminated the glass walls with cool blue light. Aisha's voice flowed steady, her tone measured, the mark of someone who knew her craft better than anyone in that room. Graphs, numbers, timelines, all meticulously prepared. The global expansion model she'd spent weeks perfecting came alive before their eyes. But the silence from the table wasn't engagement, it was skepticism. A European investor named Richard Lang leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His posture oozed confidence, the kind that comes from being told, yes, your entire career. He was one of Uber's oldest partners in the EU market, known for being brilliant and brutal. He adjusted his cufflinks and said, his British accent sharp enough to slice through her slide deck. Ms. Monroe, with respect, these projections are ambitious. Our markets don't operate with that kind of optimism. The data doesn't match the reality on the ground. He didn't say you don't understand our world, but everyone heard it. The words hung in the air, followed by the faint rustle of papers and the low murmur of agreement. Aisha paused. She didn't blink. She simply closed her tablet, her movements calm, deliberate, the way a chess master moves when she already knows the outcome of the game. Ambitious, she said softly, isn't a weakness, Mr. Lang. It's the reason Uber exists at all. If we only believed what the data said, we'd still be in one city, one country, not changing how the world moves. The older man smirked but said nothing. He wasn't used to being challenged so elegantly. Just then, from the far end of the table, one of the Chinese delegates, Mr. Wei, leaned toward his partner and began whispering rapidly in Mandarin. Their tone was sharp, dismissive. The translator at the corner of the room fumbled with his earpiece, clearly overwhelmed as three other delegates joined the hushed discussion. The rest of the board looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between the translator and the investors. Aisha understood every word. They were debating whether she had any understanding of their market, calling her strategy Western arrogance wrapped in confidence. The translator began to panic, trying to catch up, but Aisha raised her hand gently. It's all right, she said. I can respond directly. The room went still. And then, to everyone's disbelief, Aisha began speaking, not in English, but in fluent Mandarin. Her tone was perfect, respectful, articulate, and laced with cultural nuance. She began, her voice calm. I understand your concerns, but this isn't just about data, it's about trust, respect, and long-term relationships. Every sound in the room vanished. The tapping of pens, the shuffling of papers, the faint hum of the city outside, gone. Even the translator froze mid-note, his mouth slightly open. The Chinese investors straightened in their seats. Mr. Wei's skeptical expression softened, then shifted into quiet astonishment. Aisha continued, seamlessly shifting between slides while speaking in their language, explaining regional strategy, government partnerships, and cultural adaptation models, details so precise that even their internal analysts hadn't presented them that clearly. When she finished, she bowed her head slightly and said, I studied your market because I respect it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand how to build bridges, not barriers. The silence that followed was electric. Even the most cynical faces now wore looks of curiosity, and something else. Respect. Richard Lang cleared his throat, clearly thrown off by the turn of events. Well, he muttered, that's impressive. Before Aisha could respond, one of the Chinese partners leaned forward, speaking softly in Mandarin again, this time not to criticize, but to compliment. He said, Your pronunciation is excellent. And your strategy, we would like to explore this expansion further. Aisha smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet gratitude. Thank you, she replied, switching effortlessly back to English. That means a lot coming from you. The energy in the room shifted completely. What had begun as condescension was now fascination. The investors leaned in closer. The CFO, who had been holding his breath, finally exhaled. Even the translator, the poor man who had expected an exhausting meeting, sat down, shaking his head with a stunned smile. It was in that moment that everyone realized. Aisha Monroe wasn't there to defend her leadership. She was there to redefine it. Her ability to bridge cultures, to communicate beyond borders, had done more in 5 minutes than most executives could in 5 years. And yet, as the applause began, polite but genuine, Aisha didn't smile in victory. She simply looked at the faces before her and said, quietly, "Business isn't just numbers and charts. It's understanding people, in their language, their rhythm, their world." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the first investor began to clap. And then another. And another. The sound filled the boardroom like thunder, but this time, it wasn't arrogance echoing through the air. It was respect. The energy in the room had shifted, subtly at first, like a breeze before a storm. Moments ago, Aisha Monroe had been just another CEO trying to defend her numbers. Now, after her flawless response in Mandarin, she was something entirely different. The Chinese delegates whispered among themselves, their tones softer now, not questioning, but intrigued. Richard Lang sat back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes flicking between her and the glowing presentation on the wall. The balance of power had changed, and everyone could feel it. Aisha's calm smile lingered as she transitioned to the next slide, market expansion in Europe. Now, she began, as we move across the European region, cultural adaptation becomes key. Data gives us numbers, but understanding gives us leverage. Before she could continue, a French partner named Marcel leaned forward, grinning skeptically. His tone was polite, but his words carried the same edge others had used to challenge her. "Ah, et peut-être vous parlez français aussi, Madame Monroe? Ah, perhaps you speak French too, Ms. Monroe?" The comment drew a few light chuckles. It was meant to test her, to see if the Mandarin moment had been a lucky trick, a rehearsed showpiece. Aisha's eyes glinted. She turned her head slightly, met Marcel's gaze, and answered in flawless French. "Bien sûr, monsieur. J'ai commencé ma carrière à Paris, alors oui, j'ai parlé français couramment." Of course, sir. I started my career in Paris, so yes, I speak French fluently. Her pronunciation was effortless, her tone perfectly native. The laughter died instantly. The French delegation exchanged surprised looks. Marcel leaned back, blinking twice, as if unsure whether to be impressed or embarrassed. But Aisha didn't stop there. She continued her presentation in French, weaving language and leadership seamlessly. Her hands moved with purpose, confident but never showy, as she explained the European rideshare dynamics, consumer behaviors, and future policy adjustments that Uber needed to make. Every sentence was clean, every example vivid. When she paused, one of the German investors, perhaps trying to reclaim the upper hand, interjected briskly. "And can you tell us, Ms. Monroe, how you expect to handle local compliance in the DACH region? It's not as simple as translating strategy, or French charm." His tone was sharp, almost mocking. Aisha turned toward him and smiled softly, the kind of smile that said, "Challenge accepted." "Natürlich," she replied instantly, switching into German. "Ich habe 2 Jahre in München gearbeitet. Wir werden mit den Behörden zusammenarbeiten, Vertrauen aufzubauen und die lokale Fahrer zu unterstützen." Of course. I worked in Munich for 2 years. We'll work closely with local authorities to build trust and support local drivers. Her accent was near perfect. The man who had questioned her froze, his pen hovering midair. You could almost hear the collective realization sweep across the room, she speaks another one. The translator had long given up. He sat there, shaking his head and muttering something under his breath about being happily unemployed. And then, from the far end of the table, an Arabic-speaking delegate leaned forward, smiling with quiet amusement. Ms. Monroe, perhaps you also understand the Middle East, he said in English, his tone teasing but respectful. Aisha nodded, turned toward him, and replied in Arabic, her voice fluid and warm. Of course. The Middle East is one of our most promising markets. Cultural understanding is the key to success there. The man's smile widened. He placed his pen down and simply said. Impressive. Very impressive. The entire room was now silent, but not the heavy silence of skepticism. It was the silence of awe. And then, a soft voice from the corner. It was Priya, one of Uber's newest partners from India, who had been quietly observing the entire time. She leaned forward, her eyes glowing with curiosity. Ms. Monroe, she asked gently, what about Hindi? Aisha's lips curved upward into a small, knowing smile. She turned to Priya and answered without hesitation. She said. Yes, I can speak Hindi too. And our partners in India are very important to us. The room stopped breathing. 9 languages, each one flowing from her like a second heartbeat. No one smirked anymore. No one whispered. No one doubted. Even Richard Lang, the harshest critic in the room, now watched her with something resembling humility. Aisha glanced around the table, her presence commanding but kind. Gentlemen, she said, switching back to English, global leadership doesn't mean expecting others to understand us. It means doing the work to understand them. She let the word settle. In that instant, every man and woman in that room realized they weren't just watching a CEO, they were witnessing a masterclass in grace, intellect, and cultural empathy. And when the applause finally came, it wasn't out of politeness. It was out of respect. Because Aisha Monroe had done what data couldn't, she'd turned doubt into belief, and prejudice into pride. For a few long seconds after she finished speaking Hindi, the room stayed utterly still. The kind of stillness that comes when everyone in it knows something historic just happened, but they haven't yet found the words to describe it. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. A space carved by awe. Aisha stood at the center of it, calm, radiant, and completely in control. The hum of the city beyond the glass felt distant now, the only sound inside was the faint whir of the ceiling fan and the heartbeat of realization pulsing through every person at that table. Finally, one of the Chinese delegates, Mr. Wei, the same man who had doubted her first, leaned forward and broke the silence. His voice was soft, respectful. Ms. Monroe, he said, your presentation is extraordinary. We came into this meeting ready to reject your proposal. But now, I think we have much to discuss. Aisha's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't rush. She simply nodded. Thank you, Mr. Wei. I believe understanding is the first step toward partnership. Across the table, the French partner, Marcel, who had tested her earlier, smiled ruefully. You've managed to surprise even the French, madam. That is no small feat. Light laughter rippled across the table, genuine this time, not the arrogant snickers from earlier. Richard Lang, who had been quiet since his challenge was met with brilliance, finally cleared his throat. Well, he began, adjusting his glasses, I must admit, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've met CEOs who could analyze, predict, negotiate, but never one who could connect the way you just did. I think we've all underestimated you, Ms. Monroe. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Aisha glanced at him, not with pride, but with grace. It's not about underestimation, Mr. Lang, she said gently. It's about awareness. We often forget that the world we do business with speaks more than one language, more than one truth. My job isn't to impress, it's to listen. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it carried power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. She clicked her tablet again. The final slide appeared, projected revenue impact, Q4 to Q8, plus $500,000,000, global consolidated forecast. Here's what happens, she continued, when respect becomes part of the business model. The numbers spoke for themselves. The projections that once looked too ambitious now felt like inevitabilities. The strategy, her strategy, showed how Uber could reclaim and expand market presence through cultural adaptation, localized tech integration, and inclusive leadership. Every investor leaned forward, studying the details. Heads nodded. Whispered exchanges turned into open agreement. And then, one by one, they began to speak. The German investor. You have my vote of confidence. We'll back the European expansion fully. The Arabic delegate. We're interested in piloting your proposal in Dubai immediately. The Chinese partners. We will increase our investment by 20% and secure distribution rights for next year. The CFO, who had been scribbling notes furiously, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth open in disbelief. He looked at Aisha, his voice trembling slightly. That's a $500 million turnaround, at least. Maybe more if we calculate new projections. Aisha smiled faintly, her eyes glistening in the soft glow of the city skyline behind her. Around her, the once skeptical faces now looked transformed, alive with admiration. The tone had shifted from interrogation to inspiration. She closed her tablet gently and rested her palms on the glass table. Gentlemen, she said softly, Uber isn't just an American company anymore. It's a global family. And families speak more than one language, they listen, they adapt, and they grow together. For a long heartbeat, no one spoke. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, soft at first, then louder, richer, until it filled the room like thunder rolling through mountains. The sound echoed off the glass, the marble, and the hearts of everyone there. Even the translator, now utterly useless but beaming with pride, joined in, clapping with both hands as if he'd witnessed magic. Richard Lang stood up first, extending his hand across the table. You've not only saved this deal, Ms. Monroe, he said with sincerity. You've changed how we see leadership. Aisha shook his hand, her smile gentle but steady. That's all I ever wanted to do, she replied. Remind people that leadership isn't about authority, it's about understanding. As the meeting drew to a close, the investors began filing out, their earlier arrogance replaced with quiet respect. Mr. Wei lingered for a moment, then turned to her and said, In my culture, we say that those who speak the language of others open the doors to their hearts. You, Ms. Monroe, have opened many today. Aisha bowed her head slightly, humbled. Thank you, she said softly. That's the only kind of success worth having. When the glass doors finally closed behind the last investor, Aisha stood alone in the room, her reflection shimmering faintly on the glass table. The city stretched before her like a sea of light, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a slow, quiet breath of victory. She hadn't just won a deal. She had redefined what power could look like, and sound like. When the applause finally faded and the last handshake ended, Aisha Monroe stood in the quiet boardroom, her heart steady but full. The evening sun painted the skyline in molten gold, and the glass walls glowed like fire. For the first time that day, she let herself feel. She sank into one of the sleek black leather chairs, her hands resting on the table where just hours ago, men had questioned her worth. The same table that now bore witness to her triumph. The city outside shimmered, Los Angeles, alive and pulsing with ambition. But Aisha's gaze wasn't on the skyscrapers or the glowing Uber logo in the distance. Her eyes softened as she looked at her reflection on the glass, the reflection of a woman who had fought every kind of battle: silent racism, hidden doubt, invisible ceilings. For years, she had been told to fit in, to tone down, to wait her turn. But she hadn't waited. She'd built her own turn. She remembered the first board meeting she ever attended as a young intern. The men had talked around her, not to her. When she offered a suggestion, one of them had chuckled and said, "That's cute, but let's hear from someone with experience." Now, years later, those same kinds of men, or at least their reflections, had just applauded her. A small laugh escaped her lips. Not bitter, just amazed at how life circles back. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from her assistant lit up the screen. "Congratulations, Aisha. The investors just confirmed the deal, official statement coming soon, $510 million secured." She stared at the number for a second, then closed her eyes. $510 million. She had saved a $500 million business not by shouting louder, not by proving she was tougher, but by being smarter, softer, and truer to herself. By listening when others wanted to argue. By connecting when others wanted to dominate. Her father's words came back to her then, from long ago, in their small Chicago apartment. He used to tell her, "Baby girl, when you speak, don't just make people hear you. Make them feel you. That's the difference between noise and influence." And that's what she had done today. She hadn't fought to be heard. She'd made them feel her truth, through language, empathy, and intellect. As she gathered her notes, the door creaked open. It was the janitor, an older black man with kind eyes and a quiet smile. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice soft. "Sorry to disturb you. Just cleaning up." Aisha smiled warmly. "No disturbance at all." He paused, looking at her curiously. "I saw the folks leaving earlier, looked like you gave them something to think about." Aisha chuckled. "Something like that." The man nodded, still smiling. "Well, whatever you did us proud. You remind me of my daughter, she's trying to get her MBA. Says she wants to be like one of those big bosses. I think she meant like you." Aisha's throat tightened. She blinked back tears. "Tell her," she said softly, "that the world might make her prove herself twice as much, but she should never let it make her smaller. There's power in standing tall, even when they try to make you bend." The janitor nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Yes, ma'am. I'll tell her that." He tipped his cap and left quietly, leaving Aisha alone again, but somehow, she didn't feel alone anymore. She walked toward the window, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The city lights flickered like 1,000 beating hearts, and she thought of all the women, especially women of color, who were still waiting for their chance to sit at the head of the table. One day, she whispered to herself, they won't have to fight this hard to be seen. And for the first time that evening, tears came, not of sadness, but release. Her phone rang again. It was the media director from Uber's PR team. "Aisha, the press wants a quote for the story. How do you want to announce the deal?" Aisha thought for a moment. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, powerful, unbroken. Then she smiled. "Tell them," she said slowly, "that communication saved us. That when we choose to understand each other, we all win." There was silence on the line for a moment, then a quiet, odd reply. "That's perfect, Ms. Monroe." As the night deepened, Aisha stood before the window one last time, her silhouette framed against the glowing skyline. Somewhere out there, girls would see the headline the next morning, "Black Woman CEO Saves Uber's $500 million deal." But what the world wouldn't see was what truly mattered, the countless nights of study, the quiet rejections, the unspoken prayers whispered between deadlines and dreams. Aisha smiled through the glass reflection. She wasn't just the CEO of Uber. She was living proof that brilliance needs no permission, and that sometimes, the most powerful language in the world is simply belief.